The sky was a muted gray, the air thick with the humidity of an early spring morning. On the edge of the serene lake, the stillness was shattered by the shriek of tires skidding across wet asphalt. There was no time to react. The car, a small sedan, veered sharply off the road, crashing through a guardrail before plunging into the murky water below. In a heartbeat, the world shifted from calm to chaos. Water surged into the vehicle, and in the blink of an eye, the car was submerged, its taillights flickering faintly before disappearing beneath the surface. For a few agonizing moments, the only sounds were the rippling of water and the panicked cries from the car's driver. But then, as the panic mounted, a single determined bark cut through the air. Misty, the canine partner of Officer Stevens, was on the scene almost instantly. Her keen instincts had picked up the sound of the crash, even before the human ears could register it. With her handler at her side, Misty was already sprinting toward the edge of the lake, her powerful legs churning the wet ground beneath her. Her mission was clear: find the one who was in danger. Find the boy. In a split second, Misty dove into the water, cutting through the waves with precision only a trained canine could achieve. She was more than just a rescue dog. She was the team's lifeline. With every stroke, Misty's determination only grew stronger. She could sense something, a faint scent, a whisper in the water, the unmistakable odor of fear and desperation. "Stay close, Misty!" Officer Stevens shouted from the shore, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. But Misty was beyond words now. She was on a mission. The sinking car, already half submerged, was hard to spot amidst the churning water. The ripples from the crash had already spread, and the vehicle was sinking fast. There was no time to waste. Misty's nose guided her, and her instincts were razor-sharp. She followed the faint scent of the boy who was trapped inside, the glass of the car's windows barely above the surface. She barked again, louder this time, her sharp barks echoing through the cold morning air. Officer Stevens, who had been trying to reach the scene, was now scrambling into a rescue boat with the rest of the team. But they weren't fast enough. Misty was already deep in the water, pushing forward with every ounce of strength she had. Minutes felt like hours. The boy inside the car had stopped struggling. His tiny body, frozen in fear, barely moved as the car sank further into the lake's depths. The situation was dire. Without Misty's keen senses, the outcome would have been unimaginable. But Misty wasn't going to let that happen. She found the rear window, the last glimpse of air inside the sinking vehicle. Misty's barking was frantic now, as she swam circles around the car. The boy was still there, alive, but barely. The air inside the vehicle was growing thinner by the second. Misty, determined to save him, began to scratch at the window, her paws pressing against the glass as if begging for help. And then, through the window, a small, pale hand pressed back against the glass, reaching out, searching for air. The boy was alive, but how long would he stay that way? Officer Stevens, now fully equipped with dive gear, approached the scene, his heart racing. The boy was close. He could see the faint glow of Misty's silhouette in the murky water. The rescue team was ready. They needed only a few more seconds. But seconds were precious in a situation like this. Misty barked again, louder than before, her powerful voice signaling the team that they were almost there. The car was barely visible now, just a dark shadow beneath the water's surface. Officer Stevens's eyes met Misty's as he dove into the lake, joining her in the depths. He felt the adrenaline surge through his veins, pushing him faster. The boy was within reach. The team's diver, who had been in the boat, jumped into the water beside Officer Stevens, pulling the boy free from the wreckage. But even as they brought him up to the surface, Misty's job wasn't over. She continued to bark and swim alongside them, ensuring they were on the right path. "He's alive!" the diver shouted as the boy coughed, his chest rising in shallow breaths. There was a collective sigh of relief. But the battle was far from over. The boy had been underwater for too long. They would need to act fast. As the team rushed the boy to shore, Officer Stevens reached out and grasped Misty's collar. He looked down at her with admiration, but also with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had saved a life today. Again. Misty's work was far from done, though. She was always on alert, always watching, always ready for the next call. As the team returned to the shore with the boy in tow, Misty stood at attention, her eyes scanning the horizon. Don't miss a moment of Misty's heroic journey. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Heroes for Animals, and follow along with every incredible rescue story. The ambulance crew quickly arrived, the paramedics rushing to the boy's side. They worked feverishly, and it wasn't long before the boy opened his eyes, looking around in confusion. "Where am I?" he asked weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "You're safe now," one of the paramedics said softly. "You're going to be okay." Misty, sitting by the boy's side, wagged her tail gently. The boy's hand reached out to her, a weak smile crossing his lips. He was too tired to speak much more, but the gratitude in his eyes was enough to say everything. As the rescue team stood nearby, watching the boy being treated, Officer Stevens walked over to Misty and knelt beside her, his hand resting on her head. He could feel the pulse of her heartbeat, a steady rhythm of dedication and bravery. Misty had done it again. She had saved another life. And as the day wore on, the mystery of how the car ended up in the lake, why it swerved, why it crashed, still lingered in the air. There were questions to be answered, secrets to uncover. But for now, Misty was the hero, and she had earned her rest. The truth, however, was still out there, waiting to be discovered. The lake, still rippling from the recent chaos, gradually returned to its calm state as the emergency responders worked tirelessly on the shore. The boy, who had once been mere seconds away from drowning, was now wrapped in a thermal blanket, his chest rising and falling with every shallow breath. Paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing him for transport to the hospital. The air was thick with tension, and while the rescue team took pride in their work, there was a subtle unease among them. The crash wasn't an accident. Misty sat beside the boy, her watchful eyes never leaving his face. Her fur was still wet from the plunge into the freezing water, but she seemed unbothered. She had done her job, and now it was time to wait for the boy to be okay. Officer Stevens, as always, stayed close by. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm when Misty was near. He trusted her implicitly, and the bond between them was undeniable. She had been with him for years, through thick and thin. But today's rescue, it felt different. The car had gone down too fast, too hard. It wasn't just a simple accident. As the paramedics carried the boy to the ambulance, Officer Stevens pulled out his phone and dialed his superior. He needed answers. They all did. "Stevens here. I need to report something. This wasn't just an accident," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. His superior's voice crackled through the phone. "What do you mean? The crash was sudden, right? A single vehicle?" "Yeah, but something doesn't add up. The way the car swerved off the road, there was no indication of a mechanical failure, no sign of the driver losing control," Stevens replied, his mind racing. "I'm telling you, something's off." There was a pause on the other end before his superior spoke again, this time more cautiously. "We'll look into it. Keep an eye out for anything unusual." Stevens hung up, looking out over the lake. The water had already swallowed the evidence, the wreckage of the car sinking deeper with every passing minute. The authorities would no doubt comb the scene later, but something told Stevens that this wouldn't be as straightforward as it seemed. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that Misty had a way of sniffing out the truth when no one else could. As the ambulance pulled away, Misty's ears perked up. She turned to Stevens, her gaze unwavering. Stevens understood the message. It was time to follow the trail. He motioned for the rest of the team to head back to the station. They had a long day ahead. The small town was usually a quiet place, where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a predictable pace. But lately, there had been whispers in the air. The lake had claimed its share of vehicles in the past, but none had been as strange as this one. Officer Stevens had been on the force long enough to know when things didn't feel right. The tightness in his chest, the unease in his gut. It was something that couldn't be ignored. And Misty, ever the silent observer, seemed to share that same instinct. Back at the station, Stevens reviewed the accident report one more time. The driver, a man named Jason Collins, had claimed he lost control of the vehicle due to the rain. But the roads had been clear, and the crash was far too precise for it to have been a simple mistake. Collins had been uncooperative after the accident, refusing to answer questions about his whereabouts before the crash. Something wasn't right, and Stevens was determined to find out what. He called in for a follow-up report on Collins's background. Within minutes, a file was placed on his desk. As Stevens flipped through it, his eyes caught something odd. Jason Collins had been involved in a series of incidents in the past, incidents that hadn't been fully investigated. There were whispers about debts, people who might want to see him pay for something, and a string of unresolved accidents that had left more questions than answers. It wasn't long before the pieces began to fall into place. Collins wasn't just another unlucky driver. He was a man with secrets. But the deeper Stevens dug, the more his suspicion grew. Was this boy the target of something bigger? And if so, who else was involved? At the hospital, the boy's condition was stable. He had suffered from hypothermia, his small body fighting to maintain warmth, but his recovery seemed promising. His name was Ryan Matthews, and as Stevens sat in the hospital room speaking with the boy's parents, he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. Ryan's mother, a woman in her mid-30s with tear-streaked cheeks, clutched his hand tightly. Her face was pale, eyes wide with exhaustion. "I don't know what happened," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We were just driving. Everything seemed fine. And then everything was dark." Stevens studied her carefully. "Where were you headed, ma'am?" "We were on our way to see family. Just a short drive. We were going to meet my brother." She paused, the tension in her body rising. "But something feels off. I've been thinking about it, and I just don't know. Jason never told me why he swerved." Stevens's eyes narrowed. Jason Collins. That name kept popping up, and now it was clear there was more to it than met the eye. Ryan's mother didn't seem to know the full story, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes that told Stevens she knew more than she was letting on. As the hours passed, the investigation began to take shape. Stevens had reached out to the rest of the team, pulling them together to connect the dots. The crash had been no accident. But who had orchestrated it? And why? Misty's role in this had been crucial, as always. She had led them to Ryan, guided them to the submerged car, and saved a life. But her job wasn't over yet. The next steps in the investigation were just beginning. With the truth still hidden, Stevens knew they would have to dig deeper. And Misty, loyal and relentless, would be right there with him. The investigation continued to unravel, layer by layer. There was something personal about this. Someone had targeted that car, and if Stevens was right, they had been waiting for the right moment to strike. But who would go this far to hurt an innocent child? And what was the motive behind it all? As the pieces began to fall into place, Stevens's thoughts turned back to the lake, the crash, the car, and the boy. There was more to this than just a random act of fate. The truth, he realized, would be even darker than he had anticipated. The rescue was just the beginning. The real fight had only just begun. The morning after the rescue, the lake looked deceptively peaceful. The calm water, kissed by the early rays of sunlight, belied the chaos that had unfolded there less than 24 hours ago. Officer Stevens stood on the shore, gazing out at the water. He could still hear the frantic barks of Misty, his loyal canine partner, as she had led the rescue team to the submerged car. Now, he felt a sense of dread, a feeling that something wasn't right. The boy was safe, but Stevens couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the crash than anyone realized. Back at the station, the investigation was starting to heat up. The more Stevens dug into Jason Collins's background, the more troubling details surfaced. Collins had been involved in a series of incidents, most notably, a series of reckless driving charges that had been swept under the rug. It was clear that he wasn't just an unlucky driver. There was a pattern of behavior that pointed to something darker. But the deeper Stevens went, the more complicated it became. Jason Collins wasn't a random guy off the street. He had connections, and those connections seemed to be at the heart of the mystery. Stevens leaned back in his chair, his hands running through his hair as he thought about the case. It wasn't just about a car crash. No, this was something much more personal. Collins had been avoiding questions, giving short, vague answers whenever the police tried to press him. But that wasn't the worst part. As Stevens reviewed the accident report, he noticed a strange detail that he had missed earlier. Collins had not been alone in the car. There was a passenger, Ryan's father. But Ryan's father was nowhere to be found. Stevens's eyes narrowed. That was the key. Ryan's father had been in the car. Where was he now? The next few hours were a blur. Stevens called in a team of officers to begin searching for Ryan's father. They scoured the area, checking nearby woods, abandoned buildings, and even the local hospitals. But there was no trace of him. No one had seen him since the crash, and no one knew where he had gone. It didn't make sense. Meanwhile, Misty remained at the station, her sharp eyes alert to every noise, every movement. She'd been through countless rescues with Stevens, but something about this case felt different. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by an almost anxious energy. She had been with the boy on that lake, guiding Stevens and the rescue team. And now, she was sensing something was off. Her instincts were telling her that the answers they were looking for were much closer than they thought. Stevens trusted Misty's instincts more than anyone else's, so when she began pacing around the office, he knew something was wrong. He called his team together again and decided to head back to the crash site. There was something there, something that had been missed. At the lake, Stevens stood at the edge, staring at the now calm waters. It seemed impossible that such a horrific event had occurred here the day before. But Misty was insistent. She sniffed the ground, her nose moving frantically as she led Stevens down a narrow path, away from the crash site and toward a secluded area of the woods nearby. "Easy, girl," Stevens murmured, watching Misty's every move. She was on a mission, and Stevens followed her instinctively. They reached a small clearing where the trees parted slightly, allowing a glimpse of a small, run-down shack that was barely visible from the road. Stevens felt a chill run down his spine. Something told him they were about to uncover a crucial piece of the puzzle. Misty stopped at the door of the shack, her tail still and her body tense. She barked once, sharp and commanding. Stevens hesitated for only a moment before he carefully approached the door. His hand rested on the knob, and then, with a deep breath, he turned it. The door creaked open. The smell hit him first, musty, old, and dank. Inside the shack, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. But as Stevens stepped further in, his eyes caught sight of something on the floor, a small crumpled piece of paper. He bent down and picked it up, his heart racing as he unfurled it. It was a receipt from a nearby hardware store. But it wasn't the date or the items on the list that caught Stevens's attention. It was the name on the receipt, Jason Collins. Stevens's mind spun as he processed the information. Collins had been here, in this shack. But why? What connection did he have to this place? Back at the station, Stevens gathered his team once more. They had found something, but it wasn't enough. The receipt led to more questions, but no answers. Who was Jason Collins working with? And why had he left his son to drown while he fled? It was clear now that Ryan's father wasn't a victim in all of this. He was part of something much bigger. A criminal enterprise. The shack, the receipt, and the strange behavior of Collins pointed to one thing. This was no ordinary family tragedy. Jason Collins had been involved in something illegal, and Ryan's life had been collateral damage. Stevens felt his gut tighten. He wasn't just dealing with a reckless driver anymore. He was dealing with a criminal network, and Ryan had been caught in the middle of it. The question was, what did they want with the boy? Why had they tried to kill him? As Stevens continued to dig into the case, he couldn't help but remember the night of the crash. The look in Ryan's mother's eyes, the way she seemed to know more than she let on, the strange silence around Jason Collins. Everything was beginning to piece together, but the truth was elusive. For every answer Stevens uncovered, more questions arose. And all the while, Misty remained by his side, always sensing what he couldn't see, always alert, always ready. She was the key to solving this case, and Stevens knew that as long as he had her by his side, he wouldn't stop until he got the answers they all needed. As Stevens and his team prepared for the next step in their investigation, they received an unexpected call. A tip had come in. Someone had seen Ryan's father. He was alive and he was hiding. But where? The chase had only just begun. The sun had barely risen, but the tension in the small town was already palpable. Officer Stevens sat at his desk, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, but he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The investigation had taken a new turn, but with each new revelation, things only became more complicated. Jason Collins was not just an unfortunate victim of an accident, he was part of something bigger, something dangerous. Stevens had spent the night combing through the lead that had come in about Ryan's father's whereabouts. The tip had been anonymous, but it had proven useful. A witness had seen a man matching Ryan's father's description in a local motel just outside of town. That was the breakthrough they needed. Now, it was up to Stevens and his team to find out why Collins was hiding, and, more importantly, what he was trying to protect. Misty sat at Stevens's feet, her ears perked, as if she could sense the gravity of the moment. She had been quiet since they found the shack in the woods, her usual energy tempered by the seriousness of the case. It was clear she was as invested in finding the truth as Stevens was, and that was something he had come to rely on over the years. Misty wasn't just a dog to him, she was his partner, his family. After a quick briefing with his team, Stevens geared up for what could be a dangerous confrontation. The lead had taken them to a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the type of place you'd expect to find someone hiding from the law, but Stevens had learned not to trust appearances. In his line of work, everything had a way of being just the opposite of what it seemed. The drive to the motel was quiet. The small town, still sleeping under the early morning haze, passed by in a blur. Stevens kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. Why was Ryan's father hiding? Was he protecting someone? Or was he running from something far worse? The motel was a nondescript one-story building tucked away behind a row of trees. The paint was peeling, the parking lot half empty. It had the kind of quiet that made you feel like nothing good ever happened there. But Stevens didn't have time to think about the place. It was just another stop on the path to uncovering the truth. As Stevens pulled into the parking lot, Misty's ears perked up, her gaze fixed on the small office at the front. Stevens let out a deep breath, giving her a reassuring pat on the head. "Stay close," he murmured. Inside, the air was stale, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The motel clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, looked up from behind the counter as Stevens and Misty entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a little too calm for the situation. "I'm looking for a man named Jason Collins," Stevens replied, his voice steady. "He checked in last night." The woman's eyes flickered with something, a brief hesitation before she masked it with a forced smile. "Sorry, I can't give out that kind of information." Stevens stepped closer to the counter, his tone lowering. "Ma'am, we're not here for anything other than to speak with him. It's important." He glanced over at Misty, who was now standing alert by his side, her body language unwavering. The woman's gaze softened as she looked at the cane. "All right," she said with a sigh. "Room 6, but you didn't hear it from me." Stevens nodded, thanking her before heading down the narrow corridor to room 6. As they approached the door, Misty's body stiffened, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. She was as focused as ever, and Stevens could feel his heart rate increase. Whatever was about to happen, it was big. Stevens knocked once, then twice. There was no immediate response, but he could hear movement inside. "Jason Collins, we know you're in there," Stevens called out, his voice steady and commanding. "Open the door. We just want to talk." For a few moments, everything was still. Then, the sound of footsteps grew louder as the door creaked open. Jason Collins appeared in the doorway, disheveled and looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted to Stevens and Misty before settling on the ground. "Officer Stevens," Collins said in a gravelly voice, his tone flat. "I didn't do anything wrong. I already told you everything I know." Stevens studied him carefully. There was something about Collins that didn't sit right. He seemed nervous. Too nervous for someone who had supposedly been in an accident. "I think we both know that's not true," Stevens said, stepping closer. "You're not just some unlucky driver who swerved off the road. You're hiding something, and I think you're going to tell me what it is." Collins took a step back, clearly conflicted. He opened his mouth to speak, but then hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. It was as if the weight of whatever secret he was carrying was too much to bear. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Collins whispered, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean to get Ryan caught up in all of this." Stevens's eyes narrowed. "Caught up in what? What are you talking about, Collins?" Collins glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he stepped aside, motioning for Stevens to come in. "You need to understand, this goes deeper than you think," Collins said, his voice low. "I made a deal with the wrong people, and now they're threatening my family. I thought if I could just get away, keep Ryan safe, it would all blow over, but it didn't. Stevens's stomach churned. This was bigger than he could have imagined. "Who are these people, Jason? What do they want with your son?" Collins ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wild. "It's the syndicate. They've been pressuring me for months. They've got connections, and they don't play by the rules. I tried to get out, but they wouldn't let me. They knew I had to take my son with me to meet someone at the lake. That's why the crash happened. It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted Ryan to be there." Stevens could feel the weight of Collins's words settling in. This was more than just a case of reckless driving. This was organized crime, and the boy had been nothing more than a pawn. Stevens knew that they needed to move fast. The truth was out now. But it was far from over. The danger was just beginning, And it was clear that whoever had orchestrated this wasn't going to let them get away with it. The pieces were falling into place, but the question remained. Would they be able to stop it before more innocent lives were lost? As Stevens turned to leave, he glanced back at Collins, who was standing by the door, eyes wide with fear. Misty, sensing the tension in the room, barked once, her eyes never leaving Collins. She knew the fight wasn't over yet. Neither did Stevens. With a nod to his canine partner, he headed out of the room, ready to face whatever came next. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as Stevens sat in his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel, lost in thought. Misty sat in the passenger seat, her head resting on her paws, as if she too knew that something was coming. The motel encounter had been a breakthrough, but now everything felt heavier. Jason Collins had given up the truth, but that truth only raised more questions. The boy's life had been a pawn in a dangerous game, and now Stevens had to find the people pulling the strings before more lives were ruined. The motel room had revealed enough. A criminal syndicate that had its hands in everything, controlling people, using them to manipulate and profit. They had targeted Collins, and in the process, they had endangered his son. But it wasn't just about the crash. No, this was bigger. This was about a network of people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Stevens's mind raced. He couldn't do this alone. He needed backup. He needed the whole team to track down the syndicate, dismantle their operation, and protect Ryan and his family from further harm. But first, there was one more person he needed to talk to: Ryan's mother. Stevens drove to the small house just outside of town where Ryan's family lived. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but well-kept. The white picket fence was slightly chipped. The flowers in the garden had begun to bloom, but there was a sense of unease in the air. Stevens had spent enough time on cases like this to recognize when a family was hiding something. There was no doubt in his mind that Ryan's mother knew more than she had let on. She was scared, and Stevens could feel it. He knocked gently on the door, hearing the faint shuffle of footsteps from inside. When the door opened, Ryan's mother stood there, her eyes weary, but still holding that spark of determination. The moment she saw Stevens, her shoulders slumped slightly, as if she had been expecting him. "Officer Stevens," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "I've been expecting you." Stevens stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the living room. There was a photo on the wall of Ryan and his mother, smiling on a sunny day. It looked like a different time, a time before the darkness had settled over their lives. "I'm sorry to drag you into this," Stevens began, his voice gentle, "but I need to know everything. Ryan's life depends on it." Ryan's mother nodded, her hands wringing together in front of her. "I know you think Jason's the only one involved in this," she said quietly, "but he's not. She stopped herself, looking away, as if the words she was about to say were too difficult to bear. Stevens waited. "What do you mean?" "I didn't want to believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "But I've seen the people Jason was involved with. They've been coming around for months. He tried to keep it from me, but I knew he was in too deep." Stevens's heart tightened. "What kind of people?" "They're dangerous," she whispered. "They've been threatening him, threatening me, too. They've made it clear that if we didn't do what they said, Ryan would be next. They wanted something from Jason, something big, something illegal. But Jason tried to pull away from them, tried to protect us, and that's when they got to Ryan." Stevens took a deep breath. "These people, do you know who they are?" She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know who they are, but they're everywhere. They've got their hands in so many different things. Drugs, money laundering, God knows what else. Jason, he wanted to get out. But you don't just leave people like that. Stevens felt a chill run down his spine. The criminal syndicate wasn't just operating in the shadows. They were embedded in the fabric of the town, controlling things from behind the scenes. And now, Ryan was in the middle of it all. "I need you to tell me everything you can," Stevens said, his tone firm but compassionate. "We're going after them, and I need your help." Ryan's mother nodded slowly. "I can tell you what I know, but it's not much. They have people everywhere, Officer Stevens. If you go after them, they'll know. They'll stop at nothing to protect their empire." Stevens's jaw tightened. "I understand, but we can't let them control your family or anyone else. This stops now." Back at the station, Stevens called in his team. They had a plan now, a real one. They couldn't keep waiting for more clues to fall into their laps. They had to act, and they had to act fast. The longer they waited, the more Ryan's life would be in danger. Stevens briefed his team, laying out the intel they had gathered so far. They'd follow the money trail, track down the connections, and make their move. But they couldn't do it without backup. He called in federal agents, as well as contacts from neighboring counties. They needed the full force of the law to take down this syndicate and ensure Ryan's safety. Misty sat by Stevens's side, her eyes never leaving him. She knew what was coming, and she was ready. She'd been through countless rescues, but this one was different. This wasn't just about saving lives. It was about stopping an entire criminal network from destroying everything. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Stevens and his team worked tirelessly, tracking down leads, making arrests, and piecing together the puzzle. Every step they took, the closer they got to taking down the syndicate. But it wasn't without risks. The people behind this operation were ruthless, and they wouldn't go down easily. Finally, the break came when they uncovered a hidden warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place where the syndicate had been operating out of for years. Stevens knew this was it, the heart of the operation, the final confrontation. As the team prepared to move in, Stevens's phone rang. It was Ryan's mother. "They're coming," she said, her voice trembling. "Jason, he's gone. They've taken him." Stevens's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. This was personal. With the warehouse in sight, Stevens gave the signal to move in. Misty, as always, was at the front, her nose sharp, her ears alert. The team was ready for whatever was coming. The time for waiting was over. It was time to end this. As they stormed the warehouse, the criminal syndicate's operations came to a screeching halt. It wasn't without a fight. Shots rang out, but Stevens and his team were ready. Misty led the charge, her powerful instincts guiding her every step. She tackled the men who had once been untouchable, pulling them down with force. When the dust settled, it was over. The syndicate was gone. Jason Collins was found, shaken but alive, and Ryan was safe. The sun set on a town forever changed. The battle had been won, but Stevens knew that there was still work to do. The scars of what had happened would take time to heal. But for now, Ryan and his family were safe. And that was what mattered most. Stevens glanced over at Misty, who was panting but proud. She had saved another life, and in doing so, she had helped bring an entire criminal empire to its knees. And for Stevens, that was the true meaning of justice. The town had returned to its quiet, everyday rhythm. The hustle and bustle of the recent chaos had died down, leaving behind a sense of relief that hung in the air like a weight finally lifted. The truth had come out. The syndicate had been dismantled. Jason Collins was in protective custody, and Ryan and his mother were safe. For all the darkness that had surrounded this case, the light at the end of the tunnel shone brighter than ever. But Stevens knew better than to assume peace would last forever. The scars were still there, deep, invisible, and etched in the lives of those who had been caught in the web of danger. And though the criminal syndicate had been broken, Stevens couldn't shake the feeling that this was only one small victory in a much larger battle. Stevens stood on the porch of his small house, the air cool against his skin as the sun dipped below the horizon. Misty, his faithful partner, sat beside him, her head resting on his boots. He absent-mindedly scratched behind her ears, a comforting routine after the tension of the last few weeks. She let out a low whine, her eyes closing in contentment. Stevens smiled, the weight of the world feeling a little lighter for a moment. It had been a long and exhausting journey, but they had come through it together. The community had rallied around Ryan and his family, offering support in every way they could. And while the case had wrapped up, Stevens knew that the people involved in this story, Ryan, his mother, Jason, and even the others who had been manipulated, would carry the memories of what had happened for the rest of their lives. The effects of the syndicate's control wouldn't vanish overnight. Healing would take time. The phone call came as Stevens was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. Misty, always alert, perked up at the sound of his phone ringing, but it was a familiar number. It was Captain Wilson from the department, the one Stevens had worked alongside for years. "Stevens," Wilson said, his voice tense, "you did good, real good. But there's something we need to discuss." Stevens's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on, Captain?" "I can't get into the details yet, but I need you to be ready. We're talking big players here, the ones you didn't even know existed. We're not done with this syndicate just because we took down the warehouse. The trail's going cold on us, and we need eyes on the ground." Stevens set his coffee cup down. "You want me back on the case?" "I need your eyes on the streets," Wilson replied. "And Stevens, we might have to dig deeper than we've ever gone before. Be prepared." Stevens glanced over at Misty, who was now standing beside him, her head tilted in curiosity. He knew what the captain meant. This wasn't over. The layers of this case were deeper than he'd initially realized, and he had a feeling the investigation was far from finished. The criminals he'd brought down were just pawns in a much larger game. Stevens sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "I'm ready, Captain. Whatever it takes." The following days were a blur of action, late-night meetings, and continued digging into the case files. With Misty at his side, Stevens retraced every step of the investigation, connecting dots that had previously been missed. The more he learned, the more he realized how deep the syndicate's influence reached. There were powerful people, some with connections to law enforcement, some with influence in the business world, who were still pulling the strings. Stevens had underestimated the scope of what he had uncovered, and now it was all coming to a head. The pressure weighed heavily on him, but he kept his focus. The key was in the details. The evidence was there, scattered across a wide network of contacts, financial transactions, and coded communications. As Stevens dug deeper into the syndicate's operations, a new layer of mystery emerged. A name appeared in several documents, one he hadn't seen before: Victor Malone. Stevens had heard of Malone, a powerful businessman known for his charitable donations and respectable public image. But Stevens had also heard rumors. The kind of rumors that suggested Malone's reach extended far beyond what anyone knew. After days of tireless investigation, Stevens and Misty were ready. They had gathered enough evidence to make a move, but they had to do it carefully. Victor Malone was a man who knew how to protect himself, and Stevens wasn't about to rush in without solid proof. The final confrontation came on a crisp morning, the sun rising slowly over the horizon. The plan was simple, yet fraught with danger. Stevens and his team would raid one of Malone's private properties, a mansion on the outskirts of town, rumored to be a safe house for high-level members of the syndicate. Misty was already on edge. sensing the change in the air. As the team made their way toward the mansion, Stevens's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. With Misty at his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. They had been through worse, and together they could handle anything. The mansion loomed ahead, its gates towering and imposing. But Stevens had one thing they didn't: the element of surprise. He signaled to the team, and in one swift motion, they stormed the property, taking down security guards and arresting key members of the syndicate. The mansion was filled with enough incriminating evidence to put Victor Malone away for good. The sun had set by the time Stevens and Misty returned to the station. Exhausted but triumphant. Malone had been taken into custody, and the syndicate's operations were dismantled. Ryan and his family were safe, and justice had been served. But Stevens knew that the road to recovery for those affected by the syndicate would take time. For now, he was content with knowing they had made a difference. As Stevens stood outside the station, Misty by his side, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. There were no easy answers, and there was no magic solution to the scars left behind by the syndicate. But the people who had been affected by it could rest a little easier now. Thank you for following along with this story. It's a reminder that sometimes the battles we face are bigger than we realize, but with courage, determination, and the right team, justice can prevail. What do you think? Do you believe in the power of second chances and redemption? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one.